Hi, I'm David Preston, and this is part two of The Bathroom Pass is Dead. In part one, we talked a lot about self-discipline and time management. We talked about improved focus and concentration. We talked about self-pacing and engagement. And that brings us to personalized instruction and support. And again, just as a reminder, this is not a competition or even a comparison between virtual learning and the face-to-face classroom. This is simply trying to work with the hand we've been dealt in helping our learners thrive through a very difficult time and still gain the concept mastery and the skill mastery that we hope will help them at the next level. So, one of the ways that we can personalize instruction and support, and again, this is based on self-pacing and engagement, is in thinking about what the learner needs to process the information we're asking them to consider. So, some of our learners really thrive when they're doing independent practice. It's the repetition, it's the modality that best serves their needs. Other learners really need the face-to-face interaction. They need the feeling of being observed, they need to ask questions, they need to feel heard, and they need to process the information as it comes back to them and sometimes even wrestle with it. As we get to know our learners this year, I highly encourage you to think about those learners that really thrive on the conversation and those learners that don't need that much. Because that way, the people who do, we can have Zoom breakout rooms, we can even schedule individual meetings and check-ins. This transforms the one-size-fits-all approach into a much more tailored, differentiated model in terms of how we help the learners. Now, the other way to personalize instruction is to keep things relevant and to give options in actually considering which assignments and course content to consider. I'll give you an example from the spring semester. In late March, I learned something I never knew, which was that a lot of what we know about indigenous Mesoamerican culture historically was preserved by a small group of people in the area around what's now Mexico City by cloistering and quarantining during a pandemic. And that happened 500 years ago. I brought it to my students as like, wow, did you know this? It was news to all of us, so we read it together. And I changed up the journal topic. Every day we write in our journals, and it's a wonderful thing because at the end of the year, students who, some of whom haven't written very much in their lives, have an entire notebook as a record of that year of their learning. Well, most of the journals I give a topic for. Sometimes I even play music. But now, in addition to saying, hey, here's an idea or choose your own, which I also do sometimes, now I was encouraging them to think about telling their story about life during the pandemic. And my reason was simple. Someone is telling your story, online, in the media, and eventually in a history book. But that someone isn't you. And so that story doesn't look like your experience. And that's a problem. We see that in history books that even differ from state to state. And we definitely see it in a lot of the media coverage, especially right now about education and the coronavirus. I don't see very many authentic teacher and student voices unless they're being asked to comment on this controversy or that. So I sat with this for about a month. And then in April, I came back to my students and I said, hey, you know what? We could actually do this bigger. If some of you want to write longer, I'll count this as credit for, and I wanted to make sure they understood it was a choice, it was not a requirement. But I gave them a list of things that they might think about. I'll move a little bit further out of the way so you can see what I'm talking about here. And I called it Surviving with Class. And now it's an open source document. In fact, if you or your students would like to participate this year, we're still going to grow it. But making sure that our curriculum is relevant to what's happening around their lives is important. And I can't think of anything that's going on right now. I can't think of a single academic subject that isn't represented. Biology, statistics, social studies, it's all there. And the fun part is that when we connect the dots and invite the students to connect the dots, it becomes more relevant and more meaningful. Now, part of what our students have around them every single day is their network. And when they're in the classroom, they're isolated from the rest of their lives. They're a chain link fence away from the rest of reality as they know it. But when they're at home, when they have family in the house, it doesn't matter what the family's like. It doesn't matter what the house is like. That's elemental to their network. So one of the things that can happen is that we actively engage with the network. I've always done student-led conferences when it comes to back to school night. In fact, I've always called it hack to school night because the students constructively reform it and they become the learned champions of their own educational experience. Their parents interview them and they share their knowledge. Well, going back to where we started with the goal conversation in part 1, we can help families think out loud with each other about what they want to see for each other. Why are you in school? What do you envision for yourself? What is it that you want to be proud of? And for the parents and extended relatives, what makes you proud when you see this young person succeed? What does success look like for you? Those conversations can be really enriching, both because they make the educational experience more meaningful, but they also strengthen the ties between the people who are having the conversation. I found this firsthand in the spring. One thing that came up with a lot of my students was the fact that because they weren't on campus, the social pressures, the economic pressures, the familial pressures were taking them away from their ability to do the work they associate with school. So a lot of my students had to work or take care of younger siblings, and they couldn't make the Zoom calls when we scheduled them. They couldn't even watch them after hours. So I started asking questions. I started asking what might help. And one common thread was younger siblings who were, how shall I put this, energetic challenges, and there was a reluctance to engage because they didn't want the class to be distracted during the Zoom call. They didn't want me to feel distracted. It was hard enough for them. And I said, well, why don't we have a separate Zoom call? We'll do a family story time. And a few of them took me up on it. And this particular example is near and dear to my heart. This is one of the very first that I did. Other students joined later with their younger siblings. But in the top inset, you can see my daughter Tara and I. And we love Dr. Seuss, Dr. Seuss, my students would correct me. And so we read this story. Well, the young man in the picture below us joined us, and his sister had told me he's so noisy, it's going to be rough. He was the best reading audience ever. This kid was fantastic. He was so good that he was like, is there another story? And then what happened on top of that, this is the best compliment I've ever gotten as a storyteller or a teacher. My student told me later on that every time there was a Zoom recording or a Zoom meeting, all of a sudden it would get really, really quiet in the next room. And she'd think like, what's up with the younger brother? And younger brother had snuck into the room at the sound of my voice and thought it was next story time. These little stories, these moments, you know, like everybody else, I'm looking forward to being back at school. I'm looking forward to being healthy. But in the meantime, these are the advantages that virtual learning spaces give us. And I think that there are opportunities we shouldn't miss. When it comes to feedback and outcomes, I really think that we can do the same kind of personalization that we do with the instruction. So for example, in ordinary times, a student might turn in an essay, and I might give it back, and we'll each have one bite of the apple. Student writes it, I comment, grade it, and that's it. And from then on, it's lost to history. But now, I can have an entire conversation with a student, this one lasted for days, in the text thread, the comment thread that associates with their writing, and I get to watch the writing improve as the conversation evolves. It's a wonderfully rewarding experience. And I've also got choices. So for example, if a student prefers that I give the feedback in an audio format.
Hi, Destiny, it's Dr. Preston. When I read this highlighted sentence, Rice makes it clear that her purpose of this speech was to let the graduates know that no matter what circumstances or background you come from, nothing is impossible. You can succeed in whatever you put your mind to. And then there's a colon. That's a lot. Proofread this sentence and see what punctuation you can add to make it more grammatically correct.
So I really have a chance here, I'm going to get out of the way of my own text, to meet students where they live. How would you like to receive the feedback is a powerful question because it gets two very important needs met. First, it causes the student to step back and reflect. What would sink in more? Gives them a choice. They're actively engaged in helping make that decision. and they're learning about how they're learning at the same time. They can try both and see what works better. But even more deeply than that, how often does a student get asked how they'd like to receive feedback or instruction? Letting them know that we care and letting them know that we want to meet their needs doesn't compromise anything on the credibility scale, doesn't compromise anything on the I expect excellence because I want you to do well in the world scale, but it gives them the sense that somebody is like listening, that they're being heard, and that matters a bunch. In the end, we're going to come out of this year one way or the other with a story. And I'm sad to say that story is going to involve failure. Some of the stuff we'll put out there and it won't work the way we think. Some of it won't be well received. We're going to endure loss. We're going to endure hardship. Things are likely going to get worse before they get better. And I would love to be wrong. I'm putting this on video. Oh man, would I love to have somebody say, I told you so. But I'm prepared for it in case. Through that chaos, through that hardship, I don't want to miss the opportunity to give our students ownership, to give them creative license, to put them in charge of their education, and to customize where I can through virtual learning so that they come out with product that they own on the public internet that they can use to create value with prospective employers, scholarship judges, college admissions officers. But more than anything else, when they tell themselves and anyone else the story of how they endured the pandemic campus closure of 2020, 2021, I want them to feel what I learned growing up from Coach Wooden. John Wooden, you may have heard of his pyramid of success. He defines success as the peace of mind that comes from self-satisfaction in knowing that you have done the very best that you are capable to be the best that you're capable of becoming. Whatever comes our way, I hope you have a terrific next few weeks. If you need anything at all from me, if I can be of help, please send me an email, ask me questions. I'm happy to be there, and thanks for watching.